Willkommen zu diesem Interview mit Steve Meretzky. Dieses Interview bezieht sich auf die Stay Forever Spielstaffeln zu Planetfall und Stationfall. Gunnar und ich haben diese beiden Infocom-Klassiker durchgespielt im Rahmen von Stay Forever Spielt. Und nun haben wir mit dem Designer der beiden Spiele, mit Steve Meretzky, gesprochen. Das Interview ist natürlich in Englisch, Meretzky ist Amerikaner, aber wie immer gibt es ganz am Ende auch eine deutschsprachige Zusammenfassung. Wer also direkt das anhören möchte, der nutzt am besten die Kapitelmarken, um etwa eine Stunde nach vorne zu springen. Und damit starten wir das Gespräch mit Steve Meretzky.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
Hello, and let me introduce our guest. It's Steve Meretzky. He is a game developer who started his career in the early 1980s and has created a number of games that are close to our hearts. Steve started out with text adventures. He created Planetfall and Stationfall, among others, and the famous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game in collaboration with Douglas Adams. After Infocom, he worked with our friend Bob Bates at Legend Entertainment, where he created the Spellcasting Trilogy and the fabulously funny Superhero League of Hoboken. In his later career, Steve worked on numerous casual games and consulted games companies, but returned to adventures from time to time. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Steve, today we would like to talk about Planetfall and its sequel, Stationfall. Take us back to 1981. I think that was the time where you joined Infocom as a playtester. How did that come about?
Right. At the time, I was sharing an apartment with Mike Dornberg, who was Infocom's first tester. And at that point, Infocom had no office, so he was just testing on an Apple II in our dining room. And he was testing first Zork 1 and then Zork 2, so this is really going back certainly into 1980, maybe even into 1979. But often when Mike wasn't around, I would play whatever the latest build was on that Apple II. And of course, the game at that point was very buggy, and I would write down bugs as I found them. The difference was Mike was getting paid when he did that, and I was doing it for free. But the benefit was that after a year of that, Mike went off to business school. And at that point, Mark Blank was writing the next game for Infocom, which was Deadline. And he needed someone to test it. And because I had shown with my free testing of Zork 1 and Zork 2 that I was pretty good at it, he said, "How would you like to be the tester for Deadline?" I mean, it's just very crazy to think back on it now that those games went out with just a single person having play tested them. But I said sure. And so November of 1981 is officially the first dollar that I earned in the game industry. And then I tested Deadline, I tested Starcross, I tested Zork 3. And then around the fall of 1982, Mark said, "How would you like to try writing a game of your own?" And I said sure. So over the most of the course of 1983, I was sort of splitting my time between continuing to test and working on that first game, which became Planetfall. Certainly toward the beginning of that year, probably a lot more testing and a lot less working on the game. And toward the end of the year, a lot more working on the game and a lot less testing. But that's pretty much how it happened.
And at that point, when your roommates worked for Infocom, were you still a student?
No, this was a couple of years after I graduated. So I graduated with a degree in construction project management.
From MIT?
Yes, and spent the first about 2 years after I graduated working for 3 different construction companies and pretty much hating every minute of it. You know, certainly in school, I was pretty interested in the topic and using computers and computer-aided programs to find the critical path in a project and map it all out. And then once I got into the real world, it was kind of a splash of cold water. You know, none of these companies was sort of interested in those newfangled techniques. And as one boss said to me once, "Oh, no project manager worth his salt needs a computer to tell him what needs to be done next." And so was definitely not enjoying my work. And so when I got this opportunity to become a game tester instead, that wasn't a hard choice at all.
I read an interview that you gave in 1987, so in the year that Stationfall came out, in which you said that you had never owned a computer up to that point, and that you in fact hated computers.
I certainly hated them in college, because in college, everyone who was sort of into computers was like mind-numbingly, boringly into computers. It's like all they talked about. And of course, as soon as they began talking about it, they essentially switched into this foreign language, where everything was an acronym or other jargon, and they were just the most boring people to hang around with. So it wasn't that I hated computers so much as I hated computer people. And then, of course, it was before personal computers. So what computers in my time at MIT meant were like big mainframes that, you could only access via a remote terminal, or the first programming course that I took actually used punch cards, where we would basically punch little holes into these sort of, cards that were a few inches tall and maybe 8 inches wide. You'll have to translate into the metric system for your listeners. And then you take a stack of them. Basically, each stack was like the equivalent of a line of code in a program. And then basically you would feed that into a computer, and then the computer would run the program and give you the result. And so for that several seconds or minutes, you completely were using 100% of the resources of a mainframe computer. And oh my God, I remember the one time I screwed up a program and caused the computer to go into an infinite loop. Man, did I get dressed down by the TA who was in charge of the computer at that particular point in time. But yeah, it was really the dawn of personal computers around 1980, just about the time that I was graduating, that computers for the first time became interesting to me. But because I had access to all of them at Infocom, I never had a computer of my own. The first one I had was a Mac SE, one of the little early kind of cubicle Macs, which I got around 87, I think.
Typically, if you talk to people who got into the computer games or video games industry in that era, they either come from a programming background, so keen interest in computer technology, coding, or from a, let's say, storytelling background, so interested in narrative and interactivity, etc. Is any of these two true for you, or were you coming from a different angle?
Well, certainly in my case, I'm in that second category. But what was interesting was among all the game writers at Infocom, we had me with my construction background. There was Stu, he majored in physics. Dave Lebling majored in political science, I think. Brian Moriarty, I think, was an English major. Mike Berlin, I think, majored in LSD. And so none of the game writers had a computer background. I mean, all of them, or most of them anyway, had certainly a lot of computer background, but weren't computer majors. Whereas the president of the company, Joel Perez, was a computer major, and he was like the only one at the company who actually wasn't doing any hands-on computer programming.
When you started out at Infocom, this was a full-time position, right? Did you go to an office, or did you work from home like your friend?
Well, when I first started testing Deadline, that was just on an hourly basis. Then I think January 1st of 1982, I became a 50% employee. And then I think about the middle of that year, maybe June of 1982, then I became a full-time employee.
Did you work in an office, or was this stuff from home?
Yeah, so Infocom got its first office in January of 1982. It was a pretty small office. It was basically one large conference room surrounded by maybe 8 small offices. And that one central conference room acted as a conference room, and it also acted as what we called the micro room, where we had one of every computer, one TRS-80 Model 1, one TRS-80 Model 3, one Apple II, one Atari 800, and so on.
So that was where you playtested then? Or did you do this in your office? Or did you go to the micro room and tried it out on every computer?
Yeah, I mean, typically, most of the playtesting really happened on a terminal connected to our DEC 20. So a big mainframe computer off-site where we just rented time. And that was where the game development occurred. And for most of the time that the game was under development, the playtesting also occurred on the DEC 20. it was probably only toward the very end of development when you were getting closer to release that you would start doing any testing on the individual PCs.
How was office life and collaboration?
Well, I mean, at that point in early 1982, it was really just me and Mark and Joel and Gabrielle Accardi, who was sort of our office manager / head of sales. I can remember one time we were kind of waiting for Joel to get off the phone so that we could go to lunch. And Joel, finally got off the phone and we started leaving for lunch. And he said, at some point the company is going to be too big that we can't all go to lunch together. And of course, 2 years later, we were more like 100 people.
So would you say that is the reason why they gave you the chance to write your own game?
Well, I had known Mark for a number of years from our time at MIT. And so I think he kind of knew me to be a funny and creative guy. And I think also through my suggestions as I was playtesting his games, it also came out that I sort of understood the medium and kind of had a good sense for creatively what worked and what didn't work.
So your first game is Planetfall, and Planetfall is a science fiction game, obviously. Now, at the point when you started creating Planetfall, Infocom already had 2 science fiction games either out or in development, and that is Starcross and Suspended. So I wonder, how did you decide on a genre back then at Infocom? Was this your own decision, or did somebody come to you and say, hey, it would be cool if you were to create a science fiction game?
No, it was pretty much each game writer's decision. I mean, I went with science fiction because that was my favorite genre as a reader, and I didn't really even give it any thought. It was just kind of instant decision as I began working on the game that, of course, it would be science fiction. Starcross had probably been my favorite game of the first 5 Infocom games, the 3 Zorks and Starcross and Deadline. And yeah, I mean, there was no issue with that. I mean, in those days, the early adopters of PCs, the people who would be buying and playing our game, tended to be the sort of people who liked science fiction and fantasy anyways. So kind of the no-brainer genres to be creating games in.
And then you started out creating your own game, but how did you do it? Did you write stuff on paper? Did you map the game out?
Yeah, I mean, Planetfall was certainly different from my later games because, for one thing, I was learning the development system at the same time I was creating the game, which wasn't the case later on. But the first thing I did was write, if I recall correctly, about a 7-page story that was just sort of the story of the game told linearly. And that wasn't really like anything that I would ever do on any of my future games. So I did that, and at that point, the name of the game was Soul Survivor. I don't really recall when we changed the name from that to Planetfall or who came up with it or how it came up. But I do remember I wrote that sort of 7-page or so short story called Soul Survivor. And then my recollection is the next thing I worked on after that was really the geography. So kind of came up with the idea of those 2 islands with sort of 2 different complexes of buildings on them and then the kind of subway system that connected them. And probably it was really the puzzles that then came third. The idea of Floyd as a main non-player character was definitely part of the idea really from the very beginning. And I think a lot of that had sort of come out of playtesting Zork 1 and playtesting Deadline, playtesting Starcross, where those games had a lot of characters in them. And because of that, and, the size of the games in those days was incredibly limited. Like Planetfall was, I think, about 108 kilobytes, the total size of the executable. You're just really limited on everything, the number of objects, the amount of text. And so by having a number of characters, it meant that each one of those characters had to be that much kind of less deep and less interesting. And I thought if I just focus on sort of one main non-player character, I'd be able to make that character a little deeper and a little more interesting.
Writing interactive fiction at that point at Infocom essentially meant writing code, right? So how did this work and how difficult was that for you?
Sure, it meant writing code, but it was a very high-level language. It was really very kind of friendly to learn. I mean, if you had any programming background at all, it really wasn't that hard to pick up. The really complex parts of the program were stuff that I didn't touch, such as the parser. And writing the game-specific stuff, like the characters and the rooms and the objects, the takeable objects and the fixed objects, and the actions and the reactions that the game would give you to your interactions with them, that really wasn't very hard to pick up.
Did you learn on the fly, or did somebody take the time to coach you through or help you in any way?
Yeah, pretty much it would have been Mark doing the coaching, but it wasn't that much coaching because if any of the listeners are curious, I'm sure you can find pieces of Infocom code online. In fact, I think the entire Infocom code lives in a repository on GitHub and can probably be found if you poke around on the internet. But if you look at it, it's pretty readable and pretty easy to kind of figure out what's going on when you look at the code for an Infocom game.
And if I understood you correctly, you were implementing the game on a terminal that was connected to that DEC20 mainframe computer, right?
Yes. The terminal is called a VT100. And yeah, the mainframe was a DEC20, Digital Equipment Corporation. I would still say to this day, the keyboard of that VT100 is my favorite keyboard that I've ever used.
Why is that?
I don't know, just,
Felt right.
the feel of it, the sound of the keys clicking and clacking, it just was a perfect keyboard, and no keyboard since then has felt quite as perfect to me.
Infocom at that point had its own interpreter and language, but there's one thing for these early games which we are not entirely sure of where this is coming from, and this applies to Planetfall as well, because it says on a game box that it is an Interlogic game. Can you help us understand what that term meant?
Oh, that was just some stupid term that marketing came up with.
Right.
I mean, obviously there were a number of companies that were making text adventures in those days. And while ours were certainly the most sophisticated, marketing wanted something that would sort of set ours apart. And Interlogic was the term that they came up, some made up trademarkable word that they'd be able to slap on the box and make it look like it was special. And I mean, they were special, but they weren't special because of the word Interlogic.
I see. Well, then I'd say let's talk about specific design decisions that went into Planetfall. I mean, there are a couple of things which stand out also in light of Infocom's portfolio at that point in time. And let's start with the survival mechanic. So the game tracks hunger and thirst, fatigue, and the overall health. And our protagonist has to eat and drink and sleep, else they die. So why did you put that into the game?
Well, from a narrative point of view, it was a survival game. You were sort of crash landed on this planet where all the residents were in suspended animation because a horrible disease had been unleashed. And all the residents went into suspended animation so that computerized systems could search for a cure for the disease. But of course, now that you're there on the planet, you've contracted it and you're getting progressively sicker. And having to eat, having to sleep, all those just sort of went along with adding at least a little bit of verisimilitude to the idea of surviving in a hostile environment.
So you wanted to add a bit of urgency for the player?
Well, certainly. I mean, the Zork games, they really had no urgency at all. You could take as long as you wanted to solve the game. The idea with Planetfall was, no, you've crash landed on this planet and there's sort of events going on which will eventually lead to your death, not to mention the death of the planet itself. And so it was meant to be kind of a narrative urgency, but that would also carry over into the mechanics of the game. Certainly Deadline had already come out, and that even probably more so, given that you had exactly 12 hours to solve the murder or lose the game.
And do you think in hindsight that the systems that you implemented for the survival part were effective?
I think so. I mean, certainly it would take at least a few days of game time to solve the game, by which point you would be starting to get sick and you'd be running out of food. And I think it would sort of get that sense of urgency across. Another system that was new to Planetfall was in the Zork games, every move was one move. There would just be a move counter that would go up by one every time you input a sentence into the game. In Deadline, same thing, only it was 1 minute instead of one move or one turn. In Planetfall, what I wanted was different things to take different amounts of time. Again, I thought that would kind of feed into the sense of realism of being in this survival situation. So walking a short distance might only take 1 tick, and walking a long distance might take 20 ticks. Or doing a complicated action might take 5 ticks, while doing a simple action like just picking something up would take 1 tick. Those kinds of things. And that required a bit of an overhaul of the system in order to support that.
That's also on our list. However, the way that you implemented it is not like in Deadline with a time on the clock, but with a new time scale with crons and millicrons. Well, actually, it's only millicrons in the game. And we felt that was a bit strange because it actually obfuscates how much time has passed. So one would have to calculate in one's head with the help of the manual how many millicrons are the equivalent of a minute. So why not just put hours and minutes there?
I'm sure my thinking was that it just seemed more kind of exotic and science fiction-y to have a different time scale. If it made your life harder as a player, well, screw you. I think it's a good idea and I'm going to do it.
We had speculated that you simply tampered with the move system in a way and that it couldn't really replicate hours and minutes and you just had to have an intermediate system like the millicrons, but that was not the case.
No, I mean, I'm sure could have easily adapted that system to hours and minutes.
Okay, fair enough.
The game might be renamed to Red Herring, the game, because there are many, many false leads. We had these discussions and we were speculating, when I go there, I will solve that. And then, no, I'm done. We're through already. So why did you put so many false leads, so many useless items? Let's remember there was a helicopter. That bothered me greatly that I couldn't use that.
And of course, the dark rooms. And there was no way to ever get any light. But again, it was sort of an attempt to make the game a little more realistic. I mean, it always bothered me a little in particularly the Zork games, kind of how pat it was and how every single object in the environment would curiously get used by the end of the game. It just made it seem much more like a game rather than like a real environment. And that was really it. It was just, well, if you really were surviving a wreck on this planet, would every single object you find have one use? No, of course not. So that's really where it came from.
But that's something that you changed in your later games. In Stationfall, for instance, that's toned down with the red herrings. There's still useless items there, but not nearly as many as in Planetfall. So you must have reconsidered at some point.
Well, it certainly got some negative reactions, but also, I mean, the thing with every red herring is, as I said, everything I had to work with was just so incredibly limited. And a red herring basically uses up one of 256 objects was one of the limits. An object would include every room, every character, everything you could refer to, whether it was takeable or not, like a fireplace or the ocean. Every single one of those was one of your 256 objects. And so red herrings were somewhat antithetical to the idea of trying to be as efficient as possible with those very limited resources.
I find your reasoning around the red herrings in Planetfall fascinating because, if I understood you correctly, Steve, you were coming from thinking about the game world, having a realistic sense to the game world, and not from the point of view of player experience. So you were essentially designing a world, a playfield, so to speak, and were not so much thinking about how players would feel as they venture through that playfield.
I think that's accurate. I think that probably indicates to a large extent my kind of newness as a game creator, that I wasn't yet as good at sort of putting myself in the role of the player as opposed to the role of the game writer.
That's a hard thing for everyone, still today. So putting oneself in the shoes of the consumer is a hard thing. Let's talk about Floyd. You said that he was there from the beginning in your mind, in your 7-page story, perhaps even. How did you design his personality, his role in the game?
You know, that's really kind of lost in the mists of time. I don't really recall that much thought that went into it. I probably decided a robot was better because a robot was sort of an easier character than a human or human equivalent type character in terms of being believable in terms of having a more limited set of responses or reactions to anything that the player did. And in terms of his personality, I'm not really sure where that came from either. I mean, like, I remember one tester of Planetfall saying to me, "Oh, you must have like 8-year-old kids of your own, because that's what Floyd seems like." And at the time, I didn't have any kids, so that certainly wasn't it. Actually, one source, I think, one inspiration was in one of Robert Heinlein's books, Red Planet. There's a character called a Martian bouncer named Willis. He's just sort of a pet that one of the main characters in the book has. He's sort of wild and irrepressible and a little bit parrot-like in terms of repeating things that he hears and stuff like that. But years later, I think, in rereading Red Planet, I was like, I definitely see a lot of similarities between Willis and Floyd, and kind of think there might have been some influence there.
So the fact that Floyd, both in size and in personality, is childlike, that was not by design, that was basically an accident?
I think I was just trying to come up with a character who would be fun and interesting, and that's just the way he came out, but I don't really recall a lot of thought going into it.
Interesting. The Greybox release of Planetfall includes some quotes from press and players, including a quote from Dick, 33, physicist from Australia. He wrote, "This was definitely the most enjoyable and emotional game I have ever played. I have never wept tears at the computer before." Dick is, of course, referring to Floyd's sacrifice. We're assuming that this was a fairly typical reaction, was it? What kind of feedback did you get regarding that scene?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's definitely typical. I mean, the sort of big post-release article was Planetfall cover story in Softline magazine, which was a second magazine started by the same people who'd started Soft Talk, which was kind of the Apple-focused magazine, whereas Softline was games, but not just focused on Apple, but focused on games across all PCs. And they did a cover story on Planetfall where the entire cover was all text, and it was just Floyd's death scene. And I was like, kind of very mixed emotions about that, because
big spoiler.
Well, very nice that that they're giving it a cover story, but yeah, very worried about what a huge spoiler it was. But yeah, definitely after the game came out, and, you know, for the many years since then, any number of people have come up and talked about how they cried at that point in the game. And what was also interesting is a number of other people who've said to me, "Oh, I didn't cry then." But in fact, until that point, I thought Floyd was a little bit kind of annoying and thought good riddance. And then when he was gone, all of a sudden I realized I was missing him. It seemed like there was this hole in the game, or this void in the game.
When players reacted that way and magazines covered it, how was that feeling? Was this regarded by your peers at Infocom as a success, like creatively, or wasn't it noticed that much?
You know, I guess I'd say no one was too surprised. I mean, I think that's kind of how we expected people to react. I mean, the idea that Floyd was going to die was also kind of very early in my thinking about the game. Kind of as soon as I had said, okay, I want to put all my character resources into a single NPC so that I could make him more interesting. And then almost my second thought after that was, okay, once you've done that, what's the best way to get a payoff from that? And my thought was, well, the best way to get a payoff from that is to have that character die, so that there's a character who you'll be emotionally tied to, emotionally invested in. And that's certainly the most kind of emotional and narrative bang for the buck that you can get is a character's death.
But in order for that to work, players first have to be emotionally invested in that character that you're going to kill off.
Sure, which is why it happens quite late in the game.
So apparently lots of people were invested in Floyd, and I wonder, what's your take on why? Why is Floyd an effective character?
Well, I think, as we talked about earlier, I mean, he sort of has this childlike enthusiasm, and he's a little bit funny, he's a little bit wisecracky. He got sort of progressively funnier over the course of working on the game. I don't think he was really intended to be as kind of a comic relief of a character as he was. But people would keep suggesting things like, when you save the game, Floyd would say, "Oh, are we going to do something dangerous now?" which is sort of like breaking the fourth wall. And those were the sorts of little tidbits of humor around Floyd that kind of really accrued over the course of the many months of writing the game and testing the game. It's pretty interesting to go back and look at all the code associated with Floyd now. I could take it and print it out, and the definition of lines of code doesn't mean too much in Zill because you can kind of put line breaks wherever you want. They don't really matter in terms of interpreting the code. But, I could take all the code related to Floyd and print it out, and it's about 7 pages of printer paper. That's not a lot. And I think most people have this memory of Floyd that's much deeper than the actual text that appeared in Planetfall, because over the course of many tens of hours, I think they just sort of mentally fleshed him out into an even deeper character than I had written.
I agree. That is certainly what happened to me. And I think that's an amazing achievement. I mean, the sacrifice scene, I have to say, it worked very well for me, not just because of Floyd as a character, but also because it's pretty well written. But it also works well because the game has earned it. It has built up to it. As I mentioned, Floyd's sacrifice would be meaningless if we didn't care for him. And Planetfall makes us care through a string of subtle, small interactions and vignettes that emphasize Floyd's personality. As you mentioned, he's naive, he's childlike, good-natured, trusting. So it's hard not to like Floyd because he's just so innocent. But at the same time, the simple fact that he occasionally leaves and returns, also that he comments on situations, that helps establish that he has a mind of his own and that he's more than just a sidekick who tags along. He seems alive within the confines of a video game at that point in time. And this feeling of him being alive is important because when the time comes for him to make a choice, we understand that it's indeed his choice and not ours. And of course, Floyd is not just a narrative element, he's an interactive element. Even though the interactiveness is very, very, very limited in Planetfall, but it's still there, and we can and must involve Floyd in our adventure, which again brings us closer to him. And I mean, given the limitations of the medium at the time, you mentioned it, especially the limitations in disk space, you didn't have much to work with, and thus Floyd in Planetfall is kind of an exercise in narrative minimalism. And to me, that is astonishingly effective. I think it's a wonderful achievement.
Well, I guess I would just attribute it to beginner's luck.
It was a clever take to make it a child and a robot. I feel that is the base of its success as a narrative device, because this was the first time I felt a character in a text adventure not being random, even though he is. He leaves at random intervals and says random things, but he feels more alive than, say, Gandalf in The Hobbit or the thief in Zork or something, because they feel truly random. And this character, because he's a child, and it's easier to interpret something that isn't some limited scope of emotion when you have a robot or a child. So that worked very well. But that being said, you do this whole build-up through the game and the player gets invested, and then you kill the character and get all this payoff. And that is great. And then he's alive again. Why? I felt a little bit cheated.
Well, in those days, basically, we had a word for the ending of every adventure game, which was cheering elves, which, really goes back to the original adventure. At the end of the game, everything gets resolved and wrapped up in a happy bow, and it was sort of considered a game can't have an unhappy ending. It was only like a year after that Infocom did a game called Infidel about basically a treasure hunter looting a pyramid, a sort of Indiana Jones type character. And the game ends with you finally getting to the heart of the pyramid and discovering the treasure, but also realizing that there's no way out and you're trapped with the treasure and you've achieved your life's goal only to it be your death sentence. And oh my God, did people hate that ending?
Okay, fair enough. So you've already described the reactions and the feedback that you got to Floyd as a character and Floyd's sacrifice. But do you think this had any impact on a larger scale on the way that computer games and storytelling in computer games were handled after that point?
I mean, certainly Floyd is brought up to this day as, sort of an example of computer games evoking an emotional response in players. But I don't feel like it necessarily became a template or anything for kind of how to do that. And I think other than, okay, at least there's a proof point, so people can stop saying, hey, is it possible for a game to evoke an emotional response in players? Well, at least, okay, the answer to that is definitely yes. But in terms of creating a playbook or a toolbox that other game designers can use to try to achieve the same thing, I don't really feel like it necessarily had much impact in that way.
Speaking of user feedback, how many angry letters did you get because of the magnet that scrambles the keycards?
I don't recall a single one, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay, players were certainly more tolerant back then because we were pretty surprised by that when we played it these days.
Certainly, players were more tolerant, and we were certainly way stupider in terms of, as game designers, creating puzzles that were essentially unsolvable unless you saved and restored. Creating puzzles which were just ridiculously unfair. I mean, going all the way back to the original adventure where the solution to puzzles was to say these magic words like plug and zizzy. And there was absolutely no way that a player would know to do that other than hacking into the code and finding the words embedded in the code. So in those days, we definitely weren't as good at being fair to the player, and because players weren't as used to being treated fairly, they had more tolerance to being treated unfairly.
And because you didn't get negative reactions, you did it again in Stationfall. Because why not?
The magnet? I have no recollection of it in Stationfall at all.
The magnet is back, yes.
Yeah, the magnet is back.
Probably as a joke.
But in terms of difficulty, I mean, Infocom even had a rating scale back then for the games from beginner to expert. And Planetfall is rated as a standard level game, which is the second lowest after beginner. And we wondered, how were these ratings determined? And more importantly, did you as the implementer aim for a specific level?
No, not really. They were much more of a marketing thing. They were really meant to be, what game do we want to steer players toward? Zork 1 was the entry-level game for the vast majority of the Infocom player base. And yet it was one of our hardest games.
Right.
By any reasonable rating system, it shouldn't have been called a standard game. But it had to be called a standard game because marketing didn't want to discourage people from starting there. Right? Toward the end of Infocom, there was what marketing referred to as the matrix. Just think of a grid of all the genres and all the difficulty levels. So the difficulty levels were beginner, standard, advanced, and expert. And the genres were fantasy, science fiction, adventure, mystery. That created sort of a 4x4 grid, so 16 holes. And existing games kind of got slotted into those holes, leaving a few spots without any games in them. And so marketing was very anxious to get expert level adventure game or a introductory level mystery game or that sort of thing.
There's another element to difficulty, and that pertains to your use of language. I already mentioned that I found that the sacrifice scene for Floyd is particularly well written, and I think a lot of Planetfall and also Stationfall has beautiful prose. Gunnar and I, even though we're not native English speakers, we consider ourselves fairly adept in the English vocabulary, but Planetfall and Stationfall were surprisingly challenging in that regard. The language of both of these games is pretty sophisticated at times, and it contains words that we had never ever seen or heard before, something like an enunciator or a collator. And both of these words were not just used descriptively, but in such a way that we thought they might be significant, and so we had to look them up. So back then, I guess people would have looked in a dictionary, but I assume that the average US American also wouldn't know what an enunciator is, for instance. So I guess my question is, who were you writing for?
I was probably first writing for me and, second writing for kind of the other people at Infocom. At that point in the early to mid 80s, the people who owned computers tended to be the upper middle class, sort of professionals, techies themselves, sort of high earning professionals, lawyers and doctors and the like, and probably were more likely to have a bigger vocabulary. But I certainly don't recall ever worrying about it. Like you said, if you come across a word you don't know, that's what dictionaries are for, right? But the other thing you didn't mention is in Planetfall in particular, there was the alien language, which was basically just a very phonetic form of English, which, just sort of curious what your reaction as a non-English speaker was to trying to make sense of that.
We were like mixed. So I feel Christian didn't mind much, and I kind of hated it because I felt it hard to parse at first glance. So I had to sit and, squint and go through. And there was one passage I actually copied into ChatGPT in order to be sure what it meant. And ChatGPT had great skill there and translated it flawlessly. And that's perhaps because I'm not a native English speaker. So I find it distracting and kind of like a barrier between me and the game.
I was just going to say that I'm not surprised that that was your reaction to it, because that was sort of intended to be your reaction even for native English speakers. So I don't think I was at all thinking about, oh my God, how are people for whom English is only a second language going to deal with this?
I didn't mind it too much because for me it was part of the world building. I mean, the language was there for a reason. It was intended to signify that this is a civilization which had developed differently. For that purpose, it was fine with me, also because it was applied rather consistently. But yeah, you had to wade through quite a lot of text in that way. So I can understand that it can get tedious after a while. But there's another small thing that we noticed, and earlier in our conversation, when you described the punch cards, you did it using the imperial system. However, in Planetfall and Stationfall, most of the metrics are using the metric system. So stuff like meters, centimeters, liters, etc. And we thought that was pretty unusual for a US American game. Why did you do that?
Well, I've always thought the metric system makes so much more sense than the English system, and that eventually it will take over. And certainly, 100,000 years from now, or whenever Planetfall is set, it probably seemed inconceivable to me that the English system would still be around.
So it's a prediction about the future. Okay, I understand.
But again, that it was more important for you to build that world in a consistent way than to think about how your user base would react to that. And also accept that they might be stumped when they read, okay, this is so and so many centimeters long.
I think everyone, even in the US, or at least almost everyone, has at least a rough sense for kind of what a meter is and a centimeter. I don't think there was anything in the game where it was like really vital that you know exactly how big or how far something was.
That's true.
Let's leave the game proper and go to the rest of the design. The game has feelies, as it was becoming usual for Infocom games. How did the process of creating that work for Planetfall?
At that point in time, we didn't have an internal group to do that. We used an external agency to do it. Essentially, there'd just be a kickoff meeting where we'd show them the game, and some game writers kind of went in and said, I've written the game, you take care of the packaging. But I was much more holistically, kind of interested in being involved in all aspects. And so I sort of came in already with, okay, I want there to be a diary, and here's the first draft of it, and of course the disc. And anyway, they came back with their idea for, the original packaging was not the gray pinstripe packaging. It was a much larger package, as they had to be in those days because some of the early PCs had 8-inch floppy disks. 8-inch being...
What's that in the metric system?
Like 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters.
Right. Huge.
And yeah, so the package has to be much larger in those early days. And so they came up with the idea for a package, which basically would be this very, sort of stuffy, rules-based Stellar Patrol issued folio in which you had completely disregarded all the rules and were putting all these random other things in the pockets that were supposedly intended only for these other items under penalty of death. And they also came back with the cover art, or at least the idea for the cover art of the stellar patrolman in helmet and spacesuit carrying the mop and bucket. And they also completely rewrote the diary. Basically, they had taken what I had written, which was like a page and a quarter, and blown it out to 8 pages. And, I felt really kind of moved away from the picture I had of the background of the player character. And so we had a lot of pretty contentious back and forth about that, and, ended up with a compromise somewhere in between my initial version and their much longer version.
The writing style, the prose of the materials in the box, as well as in the game, to me sounded a little bit influenced by Harry Harrison, the Stainless Steel Rat. Is that something you might remember, or am I on the wrong track here?
I certainly had read The Stainless Steel Rat by that point, but I don't really recall that being an influence. I would have thought Hitchhikers would have been a bigger influence, but again, I couldn't even tell you kind of what of all the text around the packaging did I write versus did this creative agency write. Probably a lot of it was just back and forth. They'd do a draft and I'd rewrite it, and they'd rewrite it, and I'd rewrite it.
Let's talk a bit about the version history of Planetfall. The game exists in 4 different versions, and I'm not talking about versions for different computer platforms or box versions. I'm talking about version numbers. So it starts with version 20, and I think the highest one is 37. There are small differences between these versions. So obviously the game must have been updated throughout its lifespan. And it seems that was common practice at Infocom, because most of the Infocom adventures of that era have different versions. But can you help us understand the process? At what point and why was a game updated to a new version?
As we mentioned earlier, the testing before an Infocom game went out was not that rigorous, compared to what we do nowadays, for games that I work on. The testing was frighteningly minimal, and the games were hugely complicated. I mean, there were so many different things that you could try doing and so many different combinatorials, right? And so inevitably the game would go out and there would be bugs. In addition to working on whatever your current game was, you'd also get bug reports for all of your previous games, right? And you'd fix them. And every now and then, kind of right away, if the bug was a bad one, or just periodically if there were a number of minor bugs that had accrued, you'd make a new version of the game. And then that version would essentially sit there on the deck 20, right? And then one of 2 things would happen. So Infocom would order 10,000 copies of Zork 1 for the Apple II. And then those would all get sold out and they would need to reorder more. And so they would reorder more using whatever the latest version of the game was. And so those first 10,000 versions of the game on the Apple II might have been version X, but now when they needed to reorder more, that would now be version Y. And then the second thing was new microcomputers were coming out constantly during this period. Every few months, Atari or Amiga or DEC or, TI or IBM would just release a new PC. So we'd have to create new disks for that new PC, even if the game was 2 or 3 or 5 years old. And so when a new PC came out, the microgroup who was in charge of doing that would write an interpreter, which was the piece that would basically take the machine independent zip file and make it run on that new PC. And then the production group would say, okay, now we need to order disks for the Amiga. And what is the current version of Zork 1? What is the current version of Planetfall? What is the current version of Deadline? So that's how these newer versions, sort of less buggy versions of the game, kind of got out into the wild.
So that meant that an implementer like yourself would periodically return to your old games to update them.
Yeah, quite frequently. I would say probably rare for more than a week to go by where I wouldn't jump into an old game and fix some bug. And sometimes it wasn't just fixing a bug. Sometimes, here's a good example, is all the common words in Infocom games have an abbreviation.
Yeah.
All the directions certainly can be abbreviated to a single letter. And at some point, fairly early on, we were like, again is one of the most common words that people type. That couldn't be abbreviated to A because A is a word in English. So we said, what if we abbreviated it to G? And everyone loved that. And so as new versions of older games started going out, we would put the abbreviation G in for again. So they were more like upgrades to the latest standards and practices.
Sort of like patches, so to speak.
Yeah.
So this was a success, obviously, creatively. And was it a success commercially as well?
Reasonably. I mean, it sold probably about 100,000 copies in its first year, which sounds like next to nothing by today's standards. But, the third game that I did, Hitchhiker's Guide, that sold about 250,000 copies during its first year. And that was enough to make it number one on the bestseller list for like 11 straight months. So, I mean, 100,000 was pretty good. It wasn't as good as Hitchhikers. It wasn't as good as Zork, but it was still pretty good.
So it was successful enough for you to continue. You got to create more games. The games you created in the next years, perhaps not all, but most of them have very high-level concepts and elaborate mechanics that far exceed Planetfall, which is, compared to games like Mind Forever Voyaging, a relatively simple game. Would you say this reflects your progress as a designer, that you had more confidence in more complex things, or was it more like you tailored a mechanic to a certain topic?
I would say more the former. Plus, specifically in the case of A Mind Forever Voyaging, it was because Infocom, with that game, rolled out a new development system, which greatly increased the resources that we as game writers had at our disposal. So it increased the minimum memory required from 32K to 64K. And it increased the number of objects, which I mentioned was one of the really restrictions that we had in the early development system. In A Mind Forever Voyaging, the limit went from 256 to basically a ridiculously large number. I think it was 256 squared is. So more than I would ever need to worry about using up. So it was, sort of partly my ambition and partly the newly opened up resources because of that upgrade to the development system.
After Planetfall, you made a number of unique and ambitious games, like you already mentioned Hitchhiker's Guide, A Mind Forever Voyaging, Leather Goddesses. And then in 1987, you decided to do a sequel to Planetfall, which was at this point 5 years old. So it was basically old news. What prompted you to return to that universe?
Well, the idea of doing a sequel had been floating around on my list of potential projects for all that time since Planetfall. And I simply hadn't wanted to do it as much as I had wanted to do A Mind Forever Voyaging and Leather Goddesses of Phobos, but, sort of having gotten those out of the way and nothing in particular that seemed like a better idea having come up in the meantime, then it essentially just became the best current idea.
But it was not like you were driven by public opinion or the marketing department, which said, we want to have a sequel.
Yeah, I think if the marketing department had had their say, I probably would have done it sooner. But yeah, by the time Stationfall came out in 87, the signs of the death of the text adventure were already quite apparent. The size of the market was shrinking steadily, and the number of people kind of moving from playing text adventures over to graphic adventures was accelerating.
When you did Stationfall, it was, again, especially compared to the games that you did before, a pretty streamlined experience.
Well, once again, went back to using the older development system. So certainly for the last time, went back to the smaller game, but the more onerous restrictions. Partly that was because it meant a larger market. The newer development system, the one that was used for A Mind Forever Voyaging, we called it Interactive Fiction Plus. And only, I don't remember the exact number, but let's say roughly half of the PCs out there in the installed base of PCs were powerful enough to play an Interactive Fiction Plus game, whereas close to 100% of them could play the older development system. So part of it was to reach more of the market. But part of it was also, I wanted it to be a relatively less ambitious game just for the ease of getting it out in 9 or 10 months.
You had been working with Douglas Adams on the Hitchhiker's Guide game. Then Douglas Adams worked on a second game for Infocom, Bureaucracy, which I think ultimately came out shortly before Stationfall came out. And I mean, those are different games, but they share a common theme in that they both satirize bureaucracy. Was there some kind of cross-pollination there?
Not really. I mean, obviously, Planetfall also satirized bureaucracy. And certainly it wasn't as much the core of either Stationfall or Planetfall as much as it was the core of bureaucracy. Yeah, so I'd say that's really more coincidence than anything.
When you made Stationfall, you not only returned to the universe, but you had to return to a place where you were successful with a narrative device. So there was pressure to replicate the scene. So how did you work with that?
Certainly moving it from planet side to space side was a good change in terms of keeping it in the same universe, but allowing me to have a very different environment than that in the first game. The problem with a planet-based environment, it wasn't too bad in Planetfall because there were really just the 2 islands, and that was all of the planet surface that wasn't flooded. But in general, when you have any game set on a planet, it's always very tough to rein in the environment, right? You can't simulate a whole planet. And so you constantly have to be coming up with dopey reasons why the player can go in this direction or that direction. The space station was great because it's, by definition, a very limited environment that's easy to simulate.
Floyd is back in Stationfall, and Planetfall was beloved and remembered for the emotional impact that it had, in particular because of Floyd. How difficult was it for you to repeat or even top the emotional impact this time in Stationfall?
So, on the one hand, I had the benefit of being able to start with an already written character and, just sort of ported all that code over as a starting point. But then there was the tricky element in Stationfall of Floyd increasingly falling under the influence of this evil computer. And so his personality changing gradually over the course of the game. And so that was the real challenge, to introduce those changes in a way that was gradual and felt increasingly menacing and created the kind of mood I was going for.
Was it clear to you that you wanted to kill him off again this time?
Yeah, that was pretty much, so kind of my thinking was, okay, don't want him to just die again, like in Planetfall, because that would just be a repeat of what's already been done. And so I was like, okay, how could I take that to the next level? And my thought about taking it to the next level was set up a situation where not only does he die, but in order to win the game, you have to kill him. And so that was tricky to kind of create a narrative where killing him was the right thing to do rather than what obviously seems like the wrong thing to do.
And again, this is very well thought out and worked well. And this time, you're not bringing Floyd back. You're introducing a replacement character, so to speak, in Oliver, which is a much more, in my personal opinion, much more tasteful way to treat the situation, and also a smarter way to treat the situation. And I found that a very satisfying resolution.
Yeah, that's probably a sign of more maturity in me as a game designer and game writer than the ending of Planetfall.
On a side note, there are books about both games named Planetfall and Stationfall, respectively, and they play after the events of Stationfall, and Oliver is the sidekick there of the main character who has already survived Planetfall and Stationfall. Do you know why that decision was made?
Essentially, Infocom just signed a deal with a publisher to have them hire science fiction writers to write books set in Infocom's universes. I saw the manuscript for the book before it was published and pretty hated it, and, kind of told the publisher so, but we had no creative control over them.
There are two specific things that I'd like to ask you, Steve. And the first is, we've been mentioning that there are lots of false leads and red herrings in Planetfall and much less so in Stationfall. But there's one thing that made us wonder, because when we're starting the game, we have 3 forms in our inventory, and we're using all of them in the course of the game, even the early game, except for one, the mission completion form. But there's a slot in the starship where we're starting on, the SPS Duffy, where this could be fed into this form. But of course we can't yet because we haven't accomplished our mission yet. Then there's the main quest on the station, and a large part of that revolves around finding fuel cells for our space truck in order to possibly return to the Duffy. And this all kind of looks like you had originally planned for the player to return to the Duffy and end the mission there. Or did you?
Maybe. I really don't remember at all.
Too long ago. Then the second thing is also a very peculiar thing. Stationfall has this moment where you enter the dining area on a station for the first time, and there on the table sits a single cup of coffee, still steaming. If you drink that coffee, you die. It's poisoned. So we must assume that it was put there by the station's malevolent machines, potentially as a trap for humans. And that made us wonder about your relationship with coffee. Is a cup of steaming hot coffee irresistible to you?
No, I'm more of a tea drinker than a coffee drinker.
So it's more like an indication that you hate coffee, and that's why it's poisonous.
I think you might be reading a little too much into it.
Fair enough. It just stood out to us because it was such an odd thing to have a poisoned cup of coffee in the cafeteria. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I don't recall it specifically, but yeah, I think your theory is probably right, that it was that the evil entity had basically reprogrammed the food dispensing machines to poison all the food. And that's why the station is depopulated.
I mean, maybe it just stood out to us because we sometimes feel that, or often actually feel that the personality of the person or persons creating a game impacts the game. And sometimes designers put something of themselves into the games. And we wondered maybe that is an artifact, that cup of coffee that tells us something about Steve Meretzky. Or maybe there are other things in Planetfall and Stationfall which would indicate that Steve Meretzky's personality is represented in some way in these games.
Yeah, I think probably with coffee, it's just, what is the thing that you normally go to a galley for? You know, you take a coffee break, you get coffee. What's the proverbial thing that, people meet around in the office? They meet around the coffee machine.
Yeah, you may not have given this much thought, but we thought like for hours what the coffee meant and why it sat there and who put it there. Were there humans alive? Is this a trap? So we're just reflecting that to you, our play experience.
That's wonderful, though.
Stationfall has the footnotes, which are self-referential. You are even referencing yourself as the person who came up with the footnotes in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So we felt if something like that is in the game.
Right. Yeah, that was just such a fun feature in Hitchhikers. I just was too tempted to not repeat it.
Okay, then one more small thing that maybe you can help clear up, because we found that the only legal way to play Planetfall these days is by buying the Zork anthology, because that contains all of the Zork games, obviously, but it also contains Planetfall, surprisingly enough. Do you know why that is?
This is from the App Store?
That is from GOG.com, so from a digital storefront. But the Zork anthology originally was a boxed edition, which Activision brought out in the 90s, and it's just a digital equivalent of that. So back in that day, they put all of the Zork games in a box, plus Planetfall. And we thought, why on earth Planetfall?
Oh, I bet I know why. So basically, and a lot of this I only know apocryphally, but after Activision shut Infocom down, they produced several more games under the Infocom name, even though they were produced by Activision out in California. One was Return to Zork, and then Zork Grand Inquisitor, and there was a third one.
Nemesis?
Nemesis, thank you. And around that time, I was talking to Activision about doing a third Planetfall game. And, did a lot of design work on it. And, they never got to the point of moving it into production. But I bet they released the Zork games and Planetfall because those were the Infocom IPs that they were sort of actively working on in terms of trying to make new games.
Ah, I see. That would be a good explanation.
Yeah. I thought that there was a Lost Treasures app on the App Store that let you play all the old games.
Not anymore. It's been taken down. It hasn't been updated, and so it's not compatible anymore with modern phones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The final question from my side would be, Steve, you have been creating a lot of games, so you have a large ludography that spans decades. What do Planetfall and Stationfall mean to you in light of your overall work, your overall portfolio?
I mean, certainly the Infocom games in general are the things that I most get asked about, whether by the media, by fans, by other people within the game industry. And Planetfall is certainly special just by dint of being my first game. Also, as we talked earlier, the special place it has as the game that more than any other game kind of has the mantle of proving that you can evoke an emotional response in players. I mean, I like every game that I've worked on for one reason or another. And I frequently get asked, of all the games you've worked on, what's your favorite? And it's kind of like asking someone, of all your children, which one is your favorite? I mean, they're all my favorite. But yeah, there are certainly a lot of reasons why Planetfall is pretty special in my memory.
Are you ever annoyed that people constantly want to ask you about Floyd rather than talk about all of your later games?
Oh, I guess maybe a little, but not a lot, just a little.
We'd also love to talk to you about Superhero League of Hoboken or the spellcasting games, but that's for a second interview maybe at some later stage.
Okay, I'd be glad to do a future interview on that topic.
Right.
So that's all from our side. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Maybe one last thing before I forget that. Why did you actually leave Infocom?
Oh, well, Activision shut the whole studio down in 1989.
Right. And you were still there at that point?
Yeah.
Okay. That explains that. Okay, also from my side, thank you so much, Steve. This was very insightful, very helpful, gave us a better understanding of Planetfall and Stationfall and, most importantly, context. And it was just great talking to you.
Likewise. Yeah, very good to meet both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Das war unser Gespräch mit Steve Meretzky und nun kommt die deutschsprachige Zusammenfassung. Das war ein sehr launiges Interview. Wir haben spezifisch über die Infocom-Zeit von Steve Meretzky gesprochen und er hat ja danach noch weitere Karriere gemacht. Hier bei Stay Forever ist er uns auch schon mal begegnet in unserer Folge zu Superhero League of Hoboken, ein Spiel von Legend Entertainment, wo er auch der Designer war. Aber wir sprachen nun speziell über seine Anfangszeit, denn Planetfall war ja nicht nur sein erstes Spiel für Infocom, sondern sein erstes Spiel überhaupt. Wie kam es dazu, wollten wir wissen. Steve Meretzky hat am MIT, einer amerikanischen Universität, Construction Project Management studiert, also Bauleiter würde ich das übersetzen. Und zu dem Zeitpunkt, wo Infocom angefangen hat, Spiele zu vertreiben, war Steve Meretzky schon fertig. Er hat schon gearbeitet bei mehreren Baufirmen, wo es ihm gar nicht gefiel. Hauptsächlich deswegen, weil er, wie er sagte, damals schon gerne Computer eingesetzt hat, um Probleme zu lösen. Das war die Ära der ersten Heimcomputer. Und hat dann im praktischen Einsatz herausgefunden, dass sich das in der Baubranche der späten 70er noch überhaupt nicht durchgesetzt hatte. Da waren keine Computer im Einsatz. Das beißt sich ein bisschen mit Beschreibungen über ihn und auch Selbstbeschreibungen von ihm aus der Zeit damals. Da heißt es immer, Steve habe Computer gehasst. Aber er hat das bei unserer Nachfrage präzisiert und meinte, es waren nicht per se die Computer, die er nicht mochte, sondern ganz spezifisch die Leute, die sich mit Computern beschäftigten, die Nerds, die fand er doof. Und er hat in dieser Zeit in einer WG gelebt mit Mike Dornbrook zusammen. Und Mike Dornbrook, auch ein MIT-Student, der war der erste Tester von Infocom zu der Zeit von Sorg. Da hatte Infocom noch überhaupt kein Büro. Die sind ja auch aus dem MIT heraus entstanden, also aus der Universität. Und deswegen hatte Mike Dornbrook im Esszimmer der WG einen Apple II aufgebaut, um dort die ersten Sorg-Spiele zu testen. Das muss im Jahr 1980 gewesen sein. Und immer dann, wenn Mike Dornbrook nicht da war, dann hat sich Steve Meretzky an diesen Apple II gesetzt und die aktuellen Builds von Sorg gespielt und dann eben auch Bugs aufgeschrieben, mit dem kleinen Unterschied, dass Mike Dornbrook dafür bezahlt wurde und Steve nicht. Dann kam es aber so weit, dass Mike Dornbrook die Schule wechselte. Und das war zu der Zeit, wo Mark Blank, einer der Mitgründer von Infocom, gerade Deadline geschrieben hat, das zweite Adventure-Spiel von Infocom. Und weil Mike Dornbrook nicht mehr als Tester zur Verfügung stand, fragte er dann eben Steve Meretzky, ob er denn dieses Spiel testen wolle. Und das war dann auch der erste bezahlte Job. Im November 1981 erinnerte sich Steve, habe er seinen ersten $1 verdient in der Spielebranche als Tester von Deadline und dann eben in der Folge von weiteren Infocom-Spielen. Denn das war sein Fuß in der Tür als Tester, wo er erst auf Stundenbasis bezahlt wurde, dann in Teilzeit angestellt und ab Mitte 82 dann in Festanstellung. Das war auch die Zeit, wo Infocom dann inzwischen in ein festes Büro gezogen war. Ja, und im Herbst 1982, da fragt ihn Mark Blank, ob er nicht ein eigenes Spiel schreiben wolle. Die beiden kennen sich übrigens schon eine ganze Weile. Die kennen sich noch aus der Studienzeit vom MIT und Mark Blank weiß schon, dass der Steve Meretzky ein kreativer, cleverer Kerl ist und als Tester ja auch weiß, wie die Infocom-Spiele funktionieren. Also ist das relativ naheliegend, ihm zu fragen, ob er auch mal was schreiben möchte. Da sagt Steve Meretzky natürlich zu und ist dann sowohl weiterhin Tester als auch Implementer, wie die Infocom-Leute sich damals nannten, also Designer und Autor für Planetfall. Dieses Szenario für Planetfall, sagte er uns, konnte er selbst wählen. Science-Fiction-Spiele hatte Infocom zwar schon im Programm damals, aber da hat sich niemand dran gestört, dass er ein weiteres machte und er mochte Science-Fiction als Leser am liebsten. Und außerdem mochte er auch von den bisher erschienenen frühen Infocom-Spielen Starcross am liebsten. Das war nach Sorg und Deadline das dritte Infocom-Spiel und das war eben auch schon ein Science-Fiction-Titel. Planetfall hieß anfangs noch Soul Survivor und Steve Meretzky sagte, okay, er ist da so rangegangen, indem er erstmal die Story einfach runtergeschrieben hat, wie eine Erzählung, etwas, was er dann später nie wieder gemacht hätte, das einfach so linear runterzuschreiben und daraus hätte er dann die Geografie entwickelt, also die Orte, diese 2 Inseln mit der Verbindungsbahn dazwischen und dann darauf aufbauend die Rätsel. Entwickelt übrigens wurde damals auf einem DEC 20, also einem Mainframe-Computer. Und bei Infocom hatten sie Terminals, also Endgeräte, die aber verbunden waren mit diesem DEC 20. Der Steve Meretzky hat keinen Hintergrund als Programmierer, versteht sich auch nicht als Programmierer, aber die Implementers bei Infocom arbeiteten in der eigenen Skriptsprache Z-Code und die war laut Meretzky vergleichsweise gut verständlich, eine Hochsprache sozusagen, und da hatte er keine großen Probleme, sich einzuarbeiten. Infocom unterscheidet ja damals zwischen der Spielengine, also dem Parser, der sogenannten Z-Maschinen, und dem Skript, also dem eigentlichen Spiel, das dann darin läuft in dieser Engine, dem Set-Code. Und Meretzky arbeitet nur in dieser Skriptsprache und nicht in der Engine. Die wird von den Designern nicht angefasst. Das ist auch nicht so gedacht. Da gibt es eine eigene Gruppe, die Microgroup bei Infocom. Die entwickeln diese Engine weiter, portieren die auf weitere Plattformen und so weiter. Er hat uns übrigens auch erzählt, dass die Arbeit an so einem Spiel wie Planetfall keineswegs abgeschlossen war, wenn man das in den Markt gebracht hatte, sondern jeder Autor hat über Jahre hinweg auch die alten Spiele weiter betreut und Updates gemacht, hauptsächlich zum Bugfixing. Wir haben ja schon erfahren, am Anfang gab es mit Mike Dornbrook und dann mit seinem Nachfolger Steve Meretzky genau einen Tester bei Infocom. Ja, also da war es mit der Qualitätskontrolle noch nicht so weit her. Dementsprechend wurden dann halt die Bugs im Markt entdeckt. Und dann mussten aber die Designer wie Steve Meretzky immer wieder ran. Auch Jahre später hat er noch neue Updates von Planetfall gemacht, um irgendwelche Bugs zu fixen oder Engine-Updates dann da auch umzusetzen. Wir haben ihn nach den spezifischen Designentscheidungen für Planetfall gefragt. Wieso ist denn Planetfall zum Beispiel ein Survival-Spiel? Warum hat das diese Survival-Aspekte wie man muss essen, schlafen und so weiter? Und wieso hat es diesen Zeitverlauf, der anders als in Deadline, wo es ja auch schon eine Zeit gibt, dann in diesen kryptischen Millicrons dargestellt ist, statt in Minuten? Und warum hat das Spiel so viele falsche Fährten? Warum hat es diese unzugänglichen dunklen Räume, die ganzen nutzlosen Gegenstände? Und die Antwort ist eigentlich immer die gleiche. Steve hat Planetfall als ein Survival-Spiel gesehen, bei dem er ein starkes Augenmerk auf Glaubwürdigkeit gelegt hat. Er wollte, dass das ein bedrohliches Szenario ist, dass es eine gewisse Dringlichkeit auch hat, dass es da um was geht. Und deswegen sind diese Survival-Mechaniken drin, um klarzustellen, okay, es geht hier um dein Leben. Deswegen ist die Zeit drin, damit das einen authentischen Science-Fiction-Anstrich hat, damit das ein einigermaßen glaubwürdiges Zukunftsszenario ist. Übrigens hat er uns auch gesagt auf unsere Nachfrage, das ist auch der Grund, warum das metrische System überwiegend verwendet wird in Planetfall, also Zentimeter, Meter, Liter und so weiter und nicht die angloamerikanischen Maße, weil er sich dachte, also tausende von Jahren in der Zukunft wird keiner mehr Gallons und Yards verwenden. Hoffentlich. Also das gehört tatsächlich auch zu dieser Überlegung mit dazu. Es ging darum, eine realistische Anmutung dieser Welt zu haben, dass man da drin ist und ein glaubwürdiges Science-Fiction-Szenario hat, in dem man da tatsächlich auch um das Leben und Überleben kämpfen muss. Und das mit den falschen Fährten und den nutzlosen Gegenständen hat er uns auch dementsprechend erklärt, dass das zu einem authentischen Szenario dazugehörte für ihn damals, denn im echten Leben sei es ja auch so, dass nicht jeder Gegenstand, der irgendwo auf einem Schreibtisch in der Küche oder auf dem Boden rumliegt, tatsächlich irgendeine Anwendung hat. Und auch nicht alle Räume sind nützlich oder zugänglich. Das ist eine nachvollziehbare Erklärung, aber natürlich eine sehr unbefriedigende aus einer spielmechanischen Perspektive. Er ändert das auch für spätere Spiele, weil es ja in der Infocom Engine damals starke Limitierungen gab, was den Speicherplatz anging, was auch die Zahl von Gegenständen zum Beispiel anging. Und in den späteren Spielen wird ihm der effiziente Umgang mit diesen limitierten Ressourcen sehr viel wichtiger. Ja, wenn man da Items und Räume reinnimmt, die gar nicht gebraucht werden, dann belegen die ja trotzdem so einen Slot und haben dann aber überhaupt keine spielmechanische Bedeutung. Außer der Irreführung, da verschiebt sich also später durchaus sein Fokus. Aber am Anfang liegt er eben auf dieser authentischen Spielwelt und das auch viel mehr als auf der Spielerfahrung. Da war Steve im Rückblick auch selbstkritisch und sagte, naja, gut, ist halt mein erstes Spiel gewesen. Wir haben alle damals, es war ja für alle neu, ja, es waren alle Laien, die damals experimentiert haben. Da hatte er also diesen Gedanken, wie wirkt das eigentlich auf meine Spieler, wie gut werden die da durchkommen, kaum bis gar nicht im Kopf, sondern er kam eben von dieser Welt, die er erschaffen wollte. Das hat sich dann auch, wie gesagt, im Laufe der Zeit verändert, auch durch Feedback durch die Spieler. Er sagte uns, auf diese ganzen falschen Fährten in Planetfall hatte durchaus einige Kritik bekommen von den Spielenden damals. Nachvollziehbarerweise. Ich hatte ihn auch gefragt, wie viele Leute sich denn eigentlich per Brief damals vermutlich noch bei ihm beschwert hätten wegen dem Magneten, der die Magnetkarten löscht. Und da musste er kurz nachdenken und sagte dann, seiner Erinnerung nach keine. Die Menschen waren damals einfach Kummer gewohnt. Ja. Die Designer waren noch unerfahren und das war schon so ein Wettstreit. Wer denkt sich die größte Gemeinheit aus und welcher Spieler kann sie dann trotzdem umschiffen? Planetfall kam ja mit einer Schwierigkeitsgradangabe. Infocom hatte dieses System von 4 Schwierigkeitsgraden von Beginner bis Experte und Standard war der zweitunterste Schwierigkeitsgrad. Da war Planetfall eingeordnet. Wir haben Steve gefragt, ob er auf diesen Schwierigkeitsgrad hin designt habe, ob das denn der Anspruch gewesen sei, dass Planetfall ein Standardspiel sei, was auch immer das bedeutet. Und er sagte, naja, das ist Marketingkram gewesen. Ja, da habe er nicht darauf hingearbeitet oder daraufhin designt. Das habe man halt später im Marketing dann so eingeordnet, weil es einigermaßen gepasst hätte. Der wichtigste Punkt ist aber natürlich im Zusammenhang mit Planetfall und Stationfall Floyd. Floyd war laut Steve von Anfang an Teil seiner Idee, und zwar abgeleitet aus den vorhergehenden Infocom-Adventures, die er ja nun in- und auswendig kannte als Tester, nämlich aus Sorg, Deadline und Starcross. Und die haben alle mehrere Nichtspielercharaktere, teilweise wie bei Deadline sogar einen ganzen Schwung Nichtspielercharaktere, die aber als Persönlichkeiten sehr dünn, sehr oberflächlich bleiben. Und auf dieser Basis hat sich Steve damals gedacht, ich möchte gerne einen tiefer ausgearbeiteten Begleiter haben, der dann aber halt auch nur einer sein kann, aus den genannten Platzgründen. Und auch, dass dieser eine Begleiter, der dann Floyd wird, sterben würde, war von Anfang an Teil der Idee, denn wie Steve einigermaßen abgeklärt sagte, war die Überlegung nun, wenn ich also mir die Zeit nehme, diesen einen Charakter stärker auszuarbeiten und ihn damit auch emotional aufzubauen, wie kann ich dann den größtmöglichen Effekt daraus ziehen, den größten Payoff bekommen? Nun, dann muss er wohl sterben. Dann sagten wir, naja gut, damit das funktioniert, muss ja aber ein emotionales Investment in den Charakter da sein. Das muss ja dem Spiel erstmal gelingen. Und dann hatte ich eine lange Lobeshymne darauf, wie gut das gelöst ist in Floyd mit diesen limitierten Mitteln. Und nachdem ich da fertig war, sagte Steve, Naja, ich nehme an, es war Anfängerglück. Ich glaube, da stellt er sein Licht ein bisschen unter den Scheffel. Aber er sagte schon auch, der Floyd als Charakter, der ist im Spiel trotzdem ziemlich dünn. Er sagte, wenn man den ganzen Code ausdruckt, der sich mit Floyd beschäftigt und die dazugehörigen Texte, dann sind das gerade mal 7 Druckerseiten, also sehr wenig. Und die Ausgestaltung von Floyd als Charakter passiert eigentlich im Kopf der Spielenden. Da wird er dann viel größer, als das Spiel das hergibt. Dass das ein kindlicher Charakter ist, das leitet sich nicht aus einer eigenen Erfahrung mit Kindern ab, denn Steve hat damals noch keine gehabt. Und der Floyd war auch gar nicht unbedingt als ein humorvoller Charakter geplant. Das hat sich während des Schreibens dann entwickelt, auch durch Vorschläge der Kollegen, die immer wieder über die Schulter geguckt hatten und sagten, hey, Floyd könnte doch auf dieses noch reagieren und er könnte doch da noch irgendetwas tun. Im Nachhinein ist Steve dann bewusst geworden, dass es durchaus ein Vorbild gegeben haben könnte für Floyd. Denn in Robert Heinleins Science-Fiction-Roman Red Planet, der rote Planet im Deutschen, da gibt es eine Mars-Kreatur, im Englischen einen Martian Bouncer, namens Willis. Das ist so eine Fellkugel in Fußballgröße, die Intelligenz und Charakter eines jungen Kindes hat. Und da gibt es doch einige Parallelitäten zu dem, wie Floyd designt ist. Aber Steve sagte, das sei, also er kannte den Roman, hat ihn gelesen, das sei ihm erst beim Wiederlesen viel später dann bewusst geworden, dass es da eine Ähnlichkeit gibt, aber er will nicht ausschließen, dass das eine zumindest unbewusste Inspirationsquelle gewesen ist. Es gab natürlich viel Feedback damals und auch später über die Jahre zur Opferungsszene von Floyd, wo viele Leute ihm dann im Laufe der Zeit gesagt hätten, dass sie da geweint hätten bei dieser Szene. Und Steve erinnert sich auch an ein Cover eines US-amerikanischen Magazins, nämlich Softline, die in ihrer September-Oktober-Ausgabe 1983 den Anfang dieser Szene von Floyds Opfer auf das Cover gedruckt haben. Das ist ein ganz ungewöhnliches Cover, ganz in Blau gehalten und da steht dann wirklich nur, außer dem Namen des Magazins Softline, nur der Anfang dieses Textes, auch mit den Parser-Eingaben und sonst nichts, nicht der Name des Spiels, keine Erklärung dazu, nur ganz klein steht unten drunter, weiter auf Seite 30. Und wenn man auf Seite 30 aufschlägt, kommt man in einen Artikel und da wird diese Szene auch tatsächlich dann zu Ende abgedruckt. Also es ist ein großer Spoiler, zumindest wenn man in das Magazin reinblättert und da sagte Steve Meretzky dann auch, da hat er schon gemischte Gefühle damals gehabt, eine große Ehre natürlich, sein Spiel auf dem Cover, aber dann dieser Mega-Spoiler. Zumal das überhaupt nicht der Test des Spiels ist, das hatte Softline schon vorher getestet, sondern da geht es um Erzählen in Spielen dann in dem Artikel. Wir haben ihn gefragt, warum er Floyd denn eigentlich zurückgebracht hat in Planetfall. Am Ende lebt Floyd ja auf einmal wieder und das hat uns nicht besonders gut gefallen. Und er sagte dann, sie hätten damals bei Infocom einen stehenden Ausdruck gehabt, nämlich Cheering Elves, also die jubelnden Elfen, in Bezug auf das Ende eines Spiels. Am Ende eines Spiels müssen die Elfen dastehen und jubeln. Das war offensichtlich so eine stehende Regel. Es muss gut ausgehen, das Spiel. Er hatte dann als Beispiel Infidel, ein anderes Infocom-Spiel, das auch 83 erschienen ist, ich glaube ein bisschen nach Planetfall. Und das endet vergleichsweise schlecht. Da findet man am Ende nämlich den Schatz, aber wird gleichzeitig eingeschlossen und weiß, man wird nicht mehr herauskommen. Und Steve sagte, oh Gott, die Leute haben das gehasst, dieses Ende. Ja, es war wie gesagt nach Planetfall. Aber gut möglich, dass das parallel schon getestet wurde und dass es da schon kritisches Feedback dazu gab. Wie dem auch sei. Wir haben ihn auch auf ein paar von den Eigenheiten von Planetfall und auch Stationfall angesprochen. Zum Beispiel, dass die Sprache recht anspruchsvoll ist. Das hat ja doch einige Wörter, die eher ungewöhnlich sind, auch für englische Muttersprachler. Und wir wollten wissen, für wen er eigentlich geschrieben hat damals. Worauf er sagte, erstmal für sich selbst und dann für Leute mit Computern, die in dieser Zeit, in den frühen 80ern, mit großer Wahrscheinlichkeit einen hohen Bildungsgrad hatten, eine gute Ausbildung hatten, denn Computer waren schweineteuer, Heimcomputer. Das konnte sich sonst noch keiner leisten. Wobei wir ja eigentlich schon in der Ära des C64 sind, also das beginnt sich ja da gerade dramatisch zu ändern, aber für die Personalcomputer ist das sicher noch richtig. Er hat sich ansonsten keine weiteren Gedanken über das Vokabular gemacht. Er sagte uns lapidar, ja, dafür gibt's doch Wörterbücher, um das nachzugucken. Auch diese Alien-Sprache, also diese Variante des Englischen im ersten Planetfall, war in erster Linie drin, weil das halt auch zu der Weltgestaltung für ihn gehört. Also er hat da keine Rücksicht genommen auf die Lesbarkeit, schon gar nicht bei Nicht-Muttersprachlern. Für ihn gehörte das einfach zu der Ausgestaltung, der authentischen Ausgestaltung dieser Welt. Gunnar hatte gefragt, wie kamen denn die Feelies eigentlich zustande? Denn Infocom hatte ja die Eigenheit in dieser Zeit, dass den Packungen immer noch Beigaben beilagen, die sogenannten Feelies. Und Steve sagte, das wurde zu dem Zeitpunkt, wo Planetfall entstand, noch gar nicht intern gemacht. Da hatten sie noch keine Abteilung dafür, sondern von einer externen Agentur. Da hätte es dann ein Brainstorming mit der Agentur gegeben. Manchen Designern war es ziemlich egal, was die in die Packung tun. Anderen wie ihm war es wichtig, da mitreden zu dürfen. Für ihm war es vor allen Dingen wichtig, dass da ein paar Tagebuchseiten drin vorkommen. Da hat er also einen Text verfasst und den mitgegeben. Und dann wenig später sei die Agentur dann zurückgekommen, hatte ein Coverbild dabei, ein Packungsdesign-Vorschlag und so. Das stammt also alles von der Agentur und sie hätten das Tagebuch komplett umgeschrieben. Jetzt sind es 8 Seiten gewesen statt der 1,5, die er eingereicht hätte. Das gefiel ihm nicht. Da gab es dann offensichtlich ein längeres Hin und Her und als Kompromiss waren es dann die 6 Seiten, die in der Packung gelandet sind. Also mit seinen Kernthemen drin, aber durchaus auch einige Ausschmückungen und Ausgestaltung offensichtlich von der Agentur. Wir wollten wissen, wie erfolgreich Planetfall war. Steve schätzte, dass es sich 100.000 Mal verkauft hat, was für die damalige Zeit ein Hit gewesen wäre, also ein wirklich guter Erfolg. Es gibt Sales-Daten noch aus der Ära von damals, also originale Unterlagen von Infocom, die weisen darauf hin, dass das in seinen ersten Jahr und ein paar Monate ungefähr 65.000 verkauft hat. Auf Lebenszeit dann dürften es etwa 80.000 gewesen sein, also vielleicht ein bisschen weniger als in Steves Erinnerung. Nichtsdestotrotz ein sehr guter Erfolg, auch deutlich besser als Enchanter oder Infidel, die auch 1983 rausgekommen sind. Deswegen kann man sich natürlich fragen, warum nicht gleich eine Nachfolger. Aber das war damals nicht unbedingt üblich, direkt Nachfolgespiele zu machen, zumal die Designer bei Infocom offensichtlich ziemlich freie Hand hatten mit dem, was sie tun durften. Und deswegen gab es erstmal andere originelle Spiele von Steve Meretzky, also Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy und A Mind Forever Voyaging und Leather Goddesses of Phobos und so. Und 5 Jahre später dann Stationfall, den Nachfolger zu Planetfall. Warum denn jetzt auf einmal doch, wollten wir wissen. Und da sagte er, naja, der Nachfolger zu Planetfall, der sei eigentlich schon lange auf seiner Ideenliste gestanden, aber da standen andere Ideen drauf, die er lieber gemacht hat. Also zum Beispiel A Mind Forever Voyaging. Und irgendwann waren die abgearbeitet und dann war der Nachfolger zu Planetfall halt die nächstbeste Idee. Allerdings, wir sind da ja im Jahr 1987 und da war das Ende des Marktes für Text-Adventures schon absehbar. Das spielte auch maßgeblich mit rein bei der Entscheidung, nochmal zum alten Entwicklungssystem, zum alten Infocom-Parser zurückzukehren. Denn in der Zwischenzeit hatte Infocom eigentlich schon eine fortschrittlichere Technologie rausgebracht. Das A Mind Forever Voyaging, das Spiel von Meretzky von 1985, das hat die schon benutzt. Das ist die 4. Version des Setcodes, also dieser Skriptsprache. Das brauchte mehr Hauptspeicher, mehr als 64 Kilobyte vor allen Dingen und funktionierte damit auf dem C64 nicht mehr und auf anderen der 8-Bit-Plattformen. Das war wohl einer der Gründe, warum A Mind Forever Voyaging nicht sonderlich toll lief im Verkauf, weil ein guter Teil der althergebrachten Plattformen einfach nicht mehr zur Verfügung stand. Für Stationfall ist er also wieder auf den Setcode 3 zurückgegangen, der viel eingeschränkter ist, wieder mit den ganzen Limitationen, Begrenzungen der Items und so weiter, aber halt auf allen Plattformen funktioniert und damit den größeren Markt hat. Und außerdem sollte das Spiel auch in 9 bis 10 Monaten marktreif sein, also relativ schnell umgesetzt werden und auch nicht so wahnsinnig anspruchsvoll sein. Deswegen basiert Stationfall also im Endeffekt auf der gleichen Technologie wie das 5 Jahre ältere Planetfall. Dass es recht schnell gehen musste, dabei hat auch geholfen, dass das jetzt in einer Raumstation spielt. Das ist ja ein natürlich begrenzter Raum und Floyd ist wieder mit dabei, was heißt, Steve konnte den gesamten Code aus Planetfall erstmal wieder recyceln, direkt wieder als Startpunkt nehmen. Wir haben ja sogar teilweise genau die gleichen Formulierungen bei Floyd noch in Stationfall drin wie bei Planetfall. Ja, das liegt schlichtweg daran, dass das der gleiche Code ist. Und jetzt musste sich Steve ja überlegen, okay, was mache ich denn jetzt mit Floyd, was mindestens den gleichen emotionalen Effekt hat wie sein Opfer im ersten Teil in Planetfall. Und der Gedanke war dann schon relativ früh, ich muss eine Situation herbeiführen, wo Floyd nicht nur stirbt, sondern wo der Spieler oder die Spielerin sogar diejenigen sind, die ihn töten. Weil es da im Spiel umgesetzt ist, ist, dass Floyd ja peu à peu unter den Einfluss dieser bösen Maschinen fällt und dann selbst auch immer böser wird, bis er sich schließlich gegen den Spieler stellt. Und das auch so zu gestalten, dass das halt so ein gradueller Prozess ist, wo Floyd so langsam die Kontrolle entgleitet und er immer böser wird, das war offensichtlich auch eine der zentralen Herausforderungen im Schreiben des Spiels. Wir haben ihn noch nach so ein paar Details gefragt, warum steht denn da eigentlich ein giftiger, tödlicher Kaffee in der Kantine, aber da sagte er hat jetzt keinen Bezug zu Kaffee, er trinkt lieber Tee, konnte er sich nicht erklären, was er sich damals gedacht hat. Auch, dass die Fußnoten drin sind, die sind ja aus Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy und da sagte er, die fand er so eine schöne Idee, damals ein Hitchhiker's Guide, die musste er einfach nochmal übernehmen. Steves Zeit bei Infocom endet 1991, sagte er uns. Ich bin nicht ganz sicher, ob ihn seine Erinnerung da trügt. In der Zwischenzeit hatte Activision ja Infocom gekauft, 1986 war das, hatte dann noch eine ganze Reihe Spiele produzieren lassen, aber dann das Studio Infocom geschlossen. Das war aber schon 1989, nicht 91. Dieser Schließung jedenfalls fiel offensichtlich auch Steve Meretzky zum Opfer. Jahre später hat Activision dann eine Sammlung rausgebracht, die Zork Anthology, wo alle Zork-Spiele mit drauf sind und Planetfall. Wir hatten das in unserer Stay Forever spielt Staffel kurz angesprochen und uns gewundert, warum ist auf einer Sammlung von Zork-Spielen, Fantasy-Spielen, ausgerechnet das Science-Fiction-Spiel Planetfall mit drauf. Dann haben das auch Steve gefragt und erst konnte er sich nicht erinnern und dann sagte er, er hätte eine Theorie. Er habe zu dieser Zeit Gespräche mit Activision geführt über eine mögliche Fortsetzung von Stationfall. Denn Activision hatte ja eine ganze Reihe Zork-Spiele in der CD-Ära gemacht. Die haben also diese Marke wiederbelebt und offensichtlich waren sie auch daran interessiert, die Planetfall Stationfall Marke wieder zu beleben. An dem Spiel, also an Planetfall 2, wurde auch gearbeitet. Es gibt einen Trailer dazu. Steve sagte, er habe intensive Designarbeit geleistet und für das Jahr 1985 wurde es dann sogar angekündigt, ist aber am Ende nie rausgekommen. Die Zork Anthology erschien 1994 und Steve vermutet, dass das bei dieser Gelegenheit ein Versuch von Activision war, Planetfall wieder ins Bewusstsein der Öffentlichkeit zu bringen, so als Testballon sozusagen oder als ein Pflock im Sand für eine zukünftige Fortsetzung und dass deswegen Planetfall auf dieser Sammlung mit drauf war. Dann hat Gunnar ihn auch noch nach den Romanumsetzungen zu Planetfall und Stationfall gefragt und Meretzky sagte, ja, er weiß, dass es die gibt. Das war eine Entscheidung von Infocom. Da hat Infocom als Firma einen Vertrag über Buchumsetzungen zu den Adventure-Marken geschlossen. Die Designer hatten da kein Mitspracherecht. Steve hat wohl das Manuskript zumindest vorher bekommen und lesen können. Sagte, er mochte es nicht und habe das damals auch deutlich gesagt. Aber da gab es keinerlei kreatives Einspruchsrecht von ihm. Das ist dann so erschienen. Das war also ein reiner Markenverwertungsstil. Tja, und zu guter Letzt wollten wir von ihm noch wissen, was denn sein Urteil zu Planetfall vor allen Dingen und Stationfall ist. Und er sagt, die Infocom-Spiele, die er gemacht hat, sind generell schon die, nach denen er am häufigsten gefragt wird, sowohl von der Presse als auch von den Fans. Und Planetfall, das hat einen besonderen Platz in seinem Herzen, einfach deswegen, weil es sein erstes Spiel war, sein erstes Baby, aber auch, weil es ja damals relativ früh in der Geschichte der Computerspiele den Beweis angetreten hat, dass Spiele durchaus in der Lage sind, emotionale Reaktionen bei den Spielenden zu wecken. Und darauf ist er, glaube ich, immer noch stolz, auch wenn er das mit einem gewissen Understatement sagt. Und ich fragte ihn auch, stört dich das denn, dass du hauptsächlich auf Floyd angesprochen wirst und nicht auf die späteren Spiele? Und er sagte, ja, ganz klein bisschen nervt's mich schon, aber nur ein ganz kleines bisschen. Und dann haben wir ihm angeboten, dass wir gerne mit ihm auch über Superhero League of Hope können oder die Spellcasting-Spiele sprechen. Aber das ist dann ein Thema für ein anderes Interview. Das war's. Das war ein sehr nettes Gespräch und wir haben uns sehr gefreut, dass Steve Meretzky, der doch einer der großen Text-Adventure- und Adventure-Autoren dieser Generation ist, sich die Zeit für uns genommen hat. Das war meine Zusammenfassung und das war's mit diesem Interview. Ich danke euch fürs Zuhören und wünsche euch noch einen wunderbaren Tag. Bis dann.